Hello, and welcome. I'm really glad you're here, and I appreciate you choosing to spend this time improving your English with me. If you enjoy long, natural listening practice that sounds like real-life English, take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to English in Mastery, and leave a comment about where you're listening from. Your support helps this channel grow and helps learners around the world reach true fluency. This session is designed for advanced learners aiming for clear, confident speech at the C1 to C2 level. Over the next 2 hours, you'll train your listening, your intuition, and your ability to think in English without translating. This is not about memorizing rules. It's about letting the language settle into your mind naturally, the way it does for native speakers. As you listen, imagine yourself inside these situations. Respond in your head. Repeat sentences out loud if you can. Let's begin. When you think about someone who speaks English confidently, what do you actually notice first? Is it speed? Is it vocabulary? Or is it how relaxed and natural they sound? In real life, advanced English isn't about speaking fast or using impressive words. It's about clarity. It's about choosing simple, accurate language and delivering it with confidence. People who speak well don't rush. They pause. They think. They sound comfortable with their own voice. That's the kind of fluency we're building here. One of the biggest differences between intermediate and advanced speakers is comfort. Comfort with silence. Comfort with uncertainty. Comfort with not having the perfect word and still expressing the idea clearly. Think about how you speak in your native language. You don't plan every sentence. You adjust as you go. You correct yourself naturally. Advanced English works the same way. Now, let's warm up with something very real. Daily life. Not dramatic moments. Not academic topics. Just ordinary situations where real English is used every day. Imagine you're talking to someone about how your week has been. A beginner might say, "My week was busy." An advanced speaker might say, "It's been a pretty full week. I've had a lot on my plate. But I'm managing." Notice how natural that sounds. A lot on my plate. I'm managing. These are phrases people use constantly. They don't feel advanced because they're familiar. That's exactly the point. Advanced English often sounds simple. It just sounds right. Now think about how often you expose yourself to English. Not study. Exposure. Listening while you're doing something else. Walking. Cooking. Resting. Many fluent speakers didn't learn through heavy textbooks. They learned through repetition and context. Short, frequent exposure trains your brain to recognize patterns. Over time, those patterns become automatic. That's when thinking in English starts to happen. Let's pause on that idea. Thinking in English doesn't mean never translating again. It means you stop translating most of the time. It means phrases come to you as complete ideas. For example, expressions like "from time to time," "as far as I'm concerned," "that makes sense," or "I hadn't thought of it that way." You don't build them word by word. You recall them as a whole. This long listening practice helps your brain store language that way. Now let's move into a topic everyone can relate to: modern life and communication. Today, we communicate more than ever, but often in shorter, faster ways. Messages, notifications, voice notes, video calls. Because of this, many conversations stay shallow. But advanced English requires depth. It requires explaining ideas, sharing opinions, and responding thoughtfully. Imagine someone asks you, "Do you think technology has improved communication?" A simple answer might be, "Yes, it has." A more advanced answer might sound like this: "I think it's helped in many ways." especially when it comes to staying connected. At the same time, I feel like some conversations have lost depth. Notice the balance. On one hand, at the same time, this kind of structure appears constantly in fluent speech. It helps you sound calm and reasonable, not extreme. Let's practice listening for tone. Tone is just as important as words. If someone says, "I've been overwhelmed lately," they're not just sharing information. They're sharing emotion. A natural response isn't, "Okay." It's something like, "That sounds like a lot. What's been going on?" Simple, human, connected. These responses build real conversations. As you listen today, pay attention to how ideas flow, not just what words are used. Now, let's talk about a skill many advanced learners underestimate: listening to understand, not listening to reply. In many conversations, people are already preparing their response instead of truly listening. Fluent speakers stay present. They react naturally. They pick up on small details. This is why long listening practice is powerful. It trains your attention. It helps you follow ideas over time without getting lost. If you ever feel your mind drifting, that's okay. Bring it back gently, just like training a muscle. Now imagine a real conversation about personal habits. Someone might say, "I've been trying to improve my routine lately." An advanced response could be, "Yeah, I can relate to that." Small changes can make a big difference over time. I've noticed that consistency matters more than motivation. These ideas are common. You'll hear them in workplaces, dine, cafes, podcasts, and everyday conversations. The vocabulary isn't difficult. The fluency comes from how naturally the ideas are connected. Let's slow down for a moment. There's no rush here. Advanced speakers are comfortable speaking at a natural pace. They pause when needed. They don't panic if a sentence isn't perfect. If you take one idea from this session, let it be this: fluency grows through calm. Repeated exposure, not pressure, not perfection. Now let's explore something deeper: expressing opinions without sounding aggressive or unsure. In English, strong opinions don't need strong volume. They need clear structure. Instead of saying, "You're wrong," a fluent speaker might say, "I see what you mean, but I look at it a bit differently." This keeps the conversation open. It shows confidence and respect. These expressions are everywhere in real life. Listen for them. Absorb them. Let them become familiar. As we continue, you'll hear many everyday phrases like, "To be honest, now that you mention it, if I had to guess, that depends." Or, "I'm not entirely sure, but..." These are not filler. They are tools. They give you time to think while keeping your speech natural. Native speakers use them constantly. Now let's shift to something personal: goals. Almost everyone, everywhere, is working towards something: better health, better communication, a better life. Being able to talk about goals in English is a key advanced skill. A natural sentence might be, "I'm trying to focus on long-term progress rather than quick results." Or, "I'm working on building habits I can actually stick with." These sound real because they are real. People talk this way every day. As you listen, think about your own answers. You don't need to speak yet. Just think in English. That's already practice. Before we move on, let me remind you, if this style of listening helps you, like the video, subscribe to English in Mastery, and stay with me until the end. Long listening sessions like this work best when you let them play without pressure. In the next part, we'll go deeper into natural conversation flow. emotional expression, and the kinds of phrases fluent speakers use without thinking. For now, just keep listening. Let the language settle. Let it become familiar. As the language settles in, you may notice something changing. You're not trying to understand every word anymore. You're following the meaning. That shift is important. In real conversations, native speakers don't analyze sentences. They react to ideas. That's what advanced listening trains your brain to do. It teaches you to stay with the message, even if you miss a word or two. Now, think about everyday conversations that don't have a clear purpose. Small talk, casual exchanges. These moments are often underestimated, but they're where fluency shows up most clearly. Someone might say, "It's been one of those days." That sentence carries a lot of meaning. It suggests stress, tiredness, maybe frustration. A natural response isn't a question from a textbook. It's something like, "Yeah, I know the feeling. Want to talk about it." Simple, real, human. These short responses build connection. Advanced English isn't about sounding impressive. It's about sounding present. Let's look at how fluent speakers talk about uncertainty. In real life, people are rarely 100% sure. They soften their statements. They leave room for adjustment. You'll often hear phrases like, "I might be wrong, but," or, "It seems like," or, "From what I can tell." These expressions don't weaken your English. They strengthen it. They make you sound thoughtful and realistic. Imagine someone discussing a plan. A basic speaker might say, "This will work." A more natural speaker might say, "I think this could work, but we'll see how it goes." That's how people actually speak. They acknowledge uncertainty without losing confidence. Now let's talk about emotional clarity. Advanced speakers don't just name emotions. They describe them. Instead of saying, "I'm stressed," they might say, "I've been feeling a bit stretched thin lately," or, "I've had a lot on my mind." These phrases feel natural because they reflect real experiences. They're flexible. They fit many situations. Over time, you start to choose expressions that match how you actually feel, not just the closest dictionary word. As you listen, notice how often speakers avoid extremes. They don't say everything is terrible or everything is perfect. They say things like, "It's not ideal, but it's manageable," or, "It's going better than I expected." This balanced way of speaking is a strong sign of advanced fluency. It shows emotional control and clear thinking. Now imagine a conversation at work or in a professional setting. Advanced English here isn't formal or stiff. It's clear and respectful. Someone might say, "Let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture." Or, "I just want to make sure we're on the same page." These phrases appear constantly in meetings, emails, and discussions. They help organize ideas without sounding bossy or distant. Listening to them repeatedly helps them become automatic. Let's slow down again. You don't need to remember everything you hear. Your brain is doing more than you realize. Even when you're relaxed, it's absorbing rhythm, structure, and tone. This is how children learn language. Not by memorizing, but by hearing patterns again and again. Long listening sessions recreate that process for adults. Now think about how fluent speakers handle disagreement. They rarely say no directly. They soften it. They redirect. Instead of saying, "I disagree," they might say, "I'm not sure I see it that way." Or, "That's one way to look at it, but here's how I think about it." These expressions keep conversations calm. They reduce tension. They make others feel heard. This is real-world communication. It's not about winning. It's about understanding. Let's move into storytelling. Even short stories appear in daily life. Someone might explain why they were late, how their weekend went, or what happened at work. Advanced speakers organize these stories naturally. They use phrases like, "So basically," "long story short," or "what happened was." These signals help listeners follow along. They also give the speaker time to think. When you hear these patterns often enough, you start using them without effort. That's when your English begins to sound truly natural. Now imagine talking about habits and routines. This topic comes up constantly. A natural sentence might be, "I try to keep a regular routine during the week, but I'm more flexible on weekends." Or, "I've been cutting back on caffeine lately." These are not advanced words. They're advanced because of how smoothly they fit together. Fluency is about flow. It's about how one idea leads into the next. Pay attention to transitions. Words like "actually," "honestly," "by the way," or "come to think of it." These are everywhere in spoken English. They guide the conversation. They signal a change in direction. They help conversations feel alive rather than scripted. Now let's talk about confidence. Confident speakers don't rush to fill silence. They let pauses exist. They take a breath. Silence isn't awkward for them. It's natural. When you listen to long-form English like this, you start to feel comfortable with that rhythm. You stop panicking when there's a pause. You learn that it's okay to think before speaking. This alone can transform how fluent you sound. Imagine being asked a question you didn't expect. A native speaker might say, "That's a good question. Let me think for a second." This is not weakness. It's skill. It buys time and shows thoughtfulness. You can use this in almost any situation. As you continue listening, let these phrases sink in. Don't force them. Just let them become familiar. Over time, familiarity turns into instinct. Now let's move into talking about experiences. Everyone shares experiences differently. Fluent speakers often reflect as they speak. They say things like, "looking back on it," or "at the time," "I didn't realize," or "now that I think about it." These expressions allow you to show depth. They show that you're not just reporting events, but interpreting them. This is a key C1 to C2 skill. It adds layers to your speech. Let's stay with that idea. Advanced English allows you to adjust your message mid-sentence. You might hear someone say, "It was challenging, but in a good way." Or, "I was excited, though a bit nervous at the same time." These small adjustments make speech sound real. Life is rarely simple, and fluent English reflects that complexity. Now think about how often people express preferences. Instead of saying, "I like this," they say, "I tend to prefer," or "I'm more drawn to," or "I usually go for." These expressions are softer and more natural. They suggest habit and personality rather than fixed rules. As you listen, imagine using these phrases in your own life. Not to impress, but to express yourself more accurately. Before we continue further, take a moment to settle in. You don't need to do anything right now. Just listen. Let the sound of English stay with you. In the next stretch, we'll move deeper into nuance, subtle meaning, and the kind of language that separates advanced speakers from truly fluent ones. Stay with the flow. Keep listening. As you continue listening, you may notice that advanced English often lives in the details, not in big statements, but in small adjustments that change the meaning just slightly. Native speakers do this without thinking. They fine-tune what they say in real time. For example, instead of saying, "I'm tired," they might say, I'm a bit worn out, or I'm running low on energy. These expressions carry different shades of meaning. They're not dramatic. They're precise. Precision is a hallmark of C1 and C2 speech. It allows you to communicate exactly how you feel without over-explaining. Now let's talk about everyday problem solving. This comes up constantly in real conversations. Someone might say, "I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle this," or "I'm still working through a few details." These phrases sound natural because they reflect how people think. Rarely do we have instant answers. We explore. We adjust. We think out loud. Advanced English supports that process. It gives you language that matches real thinking. Imagine a conversation about plans changing. This is extremely common. A fluent response might be, "Things didn't go quite as planned, but we adapted." Or, "It was a bit last minute, but it worked out in the end." Notice the tone. Calm. Flexible. This tone matters as much as the words. It signals maturity and confidence. People trust speakers who sound grounded, even when things aren't perfect. Now, let's look at how fluent speakers give context. They don't jump straight into the main point. They set the scene. You'll hear phrases like, "For context," or "just to give you some background." This helps listeners understand the situation more easily. It's especially useful in longer explanations. When you listen to advanced speakers, you'll notice they guide you through their thinking. They don't leave you guessing. That guidance is something you can learn through exposure. Let's shift to expressing effort and progress. Many learners want to talk about improvement, but they often sound unnatural. Native speakers rarely say, "I am improving my English." They say things like, "I'm getting more comfortable with it," or "I've been making steady progress." These expressions feel more realistic. They focus on experience rather than results. This mindset is important not just for language, but for life. Now imagine discussing work, study, or personal projects. A fluent speaker might say, "It's still a work in progress," or "I'm refining it as I go." These phrases appear everywhere because they reflect reality. Most things are unfinished. Advanced English has language for that state. It allows you to sound honest without sounding unsure. Let's talk about emphasis. Fluent speakers know how to highlight what matters. They use phrases like, "The main thing is," or "What really matters here is." This helps listeners focus. It also gives your speech structure. When you listen closely, you'll notice these signals guiding your attention. Over time, you start using them naturally in your own speech. Now consider how people soften requests and suggestions. Direct commands can sound rude in English. Advanced speakers adjust their tone. Instead of saying, "Do this," they say, "You might want to consider," or "It could be worth trying." This isn't weakness. It's social awareness. It makes conversations smoother and more cooperative. These are the kinds of expressions used daily in professional and personal settings. Now, let's explore how fluent speakers talk about time. Not exact schedules, but general timing. You'll hear phrases like, "lately," "over the past few months," or "from time to time." These expressions are flexible. They allow you to speak accurately without being overly specific. Life doesn't always fit into clear timelines, and English reflects that. This kind of language helps you sound relaxed and natural. Let's slow down again. There's no need to rush through this. Long listening works because it removes pressure. You're not being tested. You're just absorbing. If your mind drifts, bring it back gently. That's part of the training. Now imagine someone sharing a concern. A fluent response might be, That's understandable. Or I can see why you'd feel that way. These phrases validate emotion. They show empathy. Real conversations are built on this kind of response. Advanced English gives you the tools to connect, not just communicate. Let's talk about reflection. Fluent speakers often reflect on experiences while speaking. They say things like, in hindsight, or if I'm being honest, or looking back, I would have handled that differently. These expressions show self-awareness. They add depth to your speech. They also make you sound thoughtful, rather than reactive. This level of reflection is common among confident speakers. Now consider how people express limits. Instead of saying, I can't do that, they say, that's a bit outside my comfort zone, or I'm not in a position to commit right now. These phrases maintain boundaries while staying polite. They're widely used in real life. Learning them helps you navigate conversations smoothly. Let's move into describing change. Change is a constant topic. People say things like, my priorities have shifted, or my perspective has changed over time. These phrases are subtle but powerful. They allow you to talk about personal growth without sounding dramatic. This is advanced, natural English. Now listen for how speakers adjust mid-sentence. You might hear, it's challenging, not in a bad way, though, or I was hesitant at first, but now I see the value. These adjustments show flexible thinking. They reflect real thought processes. Fluent speech isn't perfectly planned. It evolves as you speak. That's okay. That's natural. As you continue listening, let these patterns become familiar. You don't need to memorize them. Just recognize them. Familiarity leads to confidence. Confidence leads to clarity. And clarity is what makes speech truly effective. In the next section, we'll move further into nuance and tune, and the subtle choices that help advanced speakers sound calm, credible, and genuinely fluent. Keep listening. Stay relaxed. Let the language do its work. As the session continues, you may start to notice how much meaning is carried not by individual words, but by how ideas are framed. Fluent speakers are careful about framing. They don't just say what happened. They say how they see it. For example, instead of saying, I failed, they might say, it didn't turn out the way I'd hoped. The message is honest, but the framing is balanced. This kind of language reflects emotional maturity, and it's very common in real conversations. Advanced English gives you the tools to describe reality without exaggeration. Now let's talk about cause and effect. This comes up constantly in discussions. Native speakers often use soft connectors rather than rigid structures. You'll hear phrases like, that's partly because, or, which is why, or, as a result of that. These connectors help ideas flow smoothly. They make explanations easier to follow. When you listen to them repeatedly, your brain begins to expect them. That's when your own speech becomes more fluid. Let's move into talking about pressure. Many people feel pressure, but fluent speakers describe it in nuanced ways. Instead of saying, I'm under pressure, they might say, there's been a lot riding on this lately, or the expectations have been pretty high. These expressions sound natural because they match how people experience stress. They're indirect, but clear. This kind of language is common in workplaces, families, and social conversations. Now, consider how advanced speakers express relief. They don't just say, I'm relieved. They say, it's a weight off my shoulders, or I can finally breathe a little easier. These phrases are vivid but familiar. They're used daily. They help you sound expressive without sounding dramatic. This balance is important at higher levels. Let's slow down and focus on rhythm. Fluent English has a rhythm that feels relaxed. Speakers vary their sentence length. They mix short, direct statements with longer reflections. For example, someone might say, "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it in the end." That contrast creates impact. As you listen, feel that rhythm. Don't analyze it. Just notice how it feels. Now let's talk about how people express doubt politely. Instead of saying, "I don't believe that," fluent speakers say, "I'm not entirely convinced," or "I have some reservations about that." These phrases allow disagreement without conflict. They're especially common in professional and academic settings, but they also appear in everyday life. They signal thoughtfulness rather than resistance. Let's move into expressing appreciation. Native speakers often acknowledge effort. They say things like, "I appreciate you taking the time," or "That means a lot." These phrases build goodwill. They're simple, but powerful. Advanced English isn't always complex. Sometimes it's about choosing the right simple phrase at the right moment. Now imagine discussing long-term change. People might say, "Over time, I've come to realize," or "gradually, things started to shift." These expressions reflect reflection and growth. They're used when people talk about careers, relationships, and personal development. Listening to them helps you talk about your own journey with depth and clarity. Let's talk about hedging. Hedging is a key feature of advanced English. It means softening statements to sound more accurate and less absolute. Phrases like, "more often than not," "generally speaking," or "to some extent." These are extremely common in natural speech. They allow you to be precise without being rigid. This is one of the biggest differences between intermediate and advanced speakers. Now, consider how fluent speakers manage expectations. They say things like, "Let's see how it plays out," or "We'll take it one step at a time." These expressions communicate patience and realism. They're comforting. They reduce anxiety in conversations. This is how people speak when they're confident and grounded. Let's shift to describing motivation. Instead of saying, "I'm motivated," native speakers say, "I feel driven to," or "I'm really invested in." These expressions sound more personal and less generic. They reflect internal reasons rather than external pressure. This kind of language is persuasive and authentic. Now listen for how people talk about balance. Balance is a common theme in modern life. Fluent speakers say things like, "I'm trying to find a better balance," or "It's about knowing when to push and when to step back." These phrases are widely used because they capture real struggles. Advanced English helps you express these ideas clearly and calmly. Let's pause again. You don't need to repeat anything yet. Just stay with the sound. Let your ears do the work. Long listening trains endurance. It teaches you to stay engaged without effort. That's a skill fluent speakers have naturally. Now imagine someone explaining a decision. A fluent explanation might be, "After weighing my options, this felt like the right move," or "Given the circumstances, it made sense at the time." These phrases show reasoning. They help others understand your choices. This level of explanation is common in mature conversations. As we move forward, you'll hear more subtle shifts like these. Each one adds a layer to your understanding. Advanced English is built layer by layer. Not through memorization, but through exposure. Keep listening. Stay open. The next section will continue deepening this sense of natural, confident fluency. As you stay with the listening, you may begin to sense how advanced speakers handle complexity without sounding complicated. They don't overload their sentences. They simplify ideas without losing meaning. For instance, instead of saying, "The situation is extremely complicated and difficult to manage," they might say, "It's a lot to deal with right now." The meaning is clear. The tone is calm. This is how people speak when they're comfortable with the language. Comfort leads to clarity. Now let's talk about describing mental states. This comes up often, especially in deeper conversations. Native speakers don't always label emotions directly. They describe the experience. You'll hear phrases like, "My mind's been all over the place," or "I've had trouble switching off lately." These expressions feel natural because they reflect lived experience. They're not dramatic. They're honest. Advanced English allows you to talk about what's going on inside your head in a way that feels real. Let's move into talking about decisions and hesitation. Real life is full of hesitation. Fluent speakers acknowledge it openly. They say things like, "I went back and forth on it," or "I wasn't completely sure at first." These phrases show thoughtfulness, not weakness. They tell the listener that the decision mattered. This kind of language is very common in everyday storytelling. Now imagine someone talking about responsibility. Instead of saying, "I have responsibilities," they might say, "There's a lot resting on me right now," or "I'm carrying a fair amount of responsibility." These expressions sound more human. They suggest weight without exaggeration. This subtlety is key at higher levels of English. Let's talk about explaining mistakes. Advanced speakers don't panic when talking about errors. They frame them calmly. You'll hear phrases like, "That was on me," or "I could have handled that better." These expressions show accountability. They're widely used in professional and personal settings. They help maintain trust. This is real-world English. Now let's slow down and focus on how fluent speakers transition between ideas. They rarely jump abruptly. They guide the listener. Phrases like, "With that in mind," or "That being said," or "On a related note." These transitions help conversations feel smooth and organized. As you listen, notice how often these phrases appear. They're everywhere once you start paying attention. Let's move into describing effort without sounding exhausted. Instead of saying, "I'm working very hard," native speakers say, "I've been putting in a lot of effort," or "I've been pretty focused on it lately." These expressions sound steady. They suggest commitment without complaint. This tone is common among confident speakers. It shows control. Now, imagine a conversation about learning or improvement. A fluent speaker might say, "It's starting to click," or "I'm slowly getting the hang of it." These phrases are extremely common. They describe progress in a natural way. They don't promise perfection. They acknowledge the process. This mindset is essential for advanced learners. Let's talk about describing priorities. People often say, "That's not my top priority right now," or "I'm trying to focus on what matters most." These expressions help you communicate boundaries. They're polite, clear, and widely used. Advanced English gives you the language to protect your time and energy without sounding rude. Now consider how fluent speakers talk about uncertainty in the future. They don't make strong predictions. They say things like, "We'll see how things unfold," or "It's hard to say at this point." These phrases sound realistic. They reflect how people actually think about the future. This is especially important in professional and serious conversations. Let's move into describing comfort and discomfort. Instead of saying, "I'm uncomfortable," people often say, "I don't feel entirely comfortable with that," or "That doesn't sit quite right with me." These expressions are subtle but clear. They allow you to express discomfort without creating conflict. This is a high-level communication skill. Now listen for how fluent speakers express agreement. They rarely just say yes. They say things like, exactly, or that's exactly how I see it, or I couldn't agree more. These phrases show engagement. They make conversations more dynamic. They signal alignment and understanding. Let's talk about how people express distance politely. Instead of saying, I don't care, they say, I'm a bit removed from that. Or, it's not something I'm closely involved in. These expressions maintain politeness while creating space. They're useful in many social situations. Now imagine someone reflecting on change again. You might hear, I'm in a different place now. Or, my priorities have evolved. These phrases are common because people change constantly. Advanced English allows you to describe that change smoothly. It doesn't lock you into fixed identities. Let's slow down once more. Notice how your understanding feels now compared to the beginning. You're likely following ideas more easily. That's not because the language got simpler. It's because your brain adjusted. This is the power of sustained listening. It builds endurance. It builds intuition. Now let's move into describing collaboration. Fluent speakers say things like, we're working through it together. Or, it's been a team effort. These phrases highlight cooperation. They're widely used in workplaces and communities. They sound natural because they reflect real dynamics. Let's talk about expressing limits again, but more subtly. Instead of saying, I don't have time, people say, I'm a bit stretched at the moment. Or, I've got a lot on my plate right now. These phrases are everywhere in daily English. They soften refusal while remaining honest. This balance is essential. Now, consider how advanced speakers describe learning from experience. They say, it was a learning curve, or it taught me a lot. These expressions are concise but meaningful. They summarize complex experiences in simple language. This is advanced fluency in action. Let's stay with the flow. You don't need to analyze anything. Just let the rhythm continue. In the next part, we'll explore even finer shades of meaning, subtle confidence, and the quiet language choices that make speech sound truly native. Keep listening. As you remain with the flow of listening, you may begin to sense a quiet confidence in the way fluent speakers choose their words. They don't rush to prove anything. They let meaning speak for itself. This confidence shows up in how they describe situations. Instead of saying, this is very important, they might say, this matters more than it seems. The difference is subtle, but powerful. It invites attention without demanding it. That's a common trait of advanced English. Now let's talk about how people describe patterns in their lives. Native speakers often reflect on habits over time. You'll hear phrases like, I tend to fall into certain routines, or I've noticed a pattern with how I work best. These expressions show self-awareness. They're common in conversations about productivity, relationships, and personal growth. Advanced English allows you to talk about patterns without sounding analytical. It stays grounded in experience. Let's move into talking about energy and focus. Instead of saying, I'm tired, people say, I'm feeling a bit drained, or my focus hasn't been great today. These phrases feel more accurate. They describe specific states rather than general feelings. This precision helps others understand you better. It also makes your speech sound more natural. Now imagine discussing progress again, but in a realistic way. Fluent speakers rarely say, I've improved a lot. They say things like, I'm more comfortable than I used to be, or it's starting to feel more natural. These expressions reflect gradual change. They avoid exaggeration. This realism is very common among native speakers. Let's talk about how people express interest. Instead of saying, I'm interested in that, they say, that really caught my attention. Or I find that genuinely interesting. These phrases sound engaged. They show curiosity. They're often used in conversations where people want to connect on a deeper level. Advanced English gives you the tools to show interest without sounding forced. Now, consider how fluent speakers describe responsibility again, but from a different angle. They might say, I take that pretty seriously, or I feel accountable for how it turns out. These expressions show ownership. They're calm and direct. They appear frequently in professional environments, but also in personal commitments. This is how people express reliability in English. Let's move into how people soften negative feedback. Instead of saying, this is bad, they say, there's room for improvement. Or it could be a bit stronger. These phrases are extremely common. They allow honesty without discouragement. Learning to recognize and use them is a key C1 skill. Now listen for how fluent speakers talk about alignment. They say things like, we're on the same wavelength, or that lines up with what I was thinking. These expressions show shared understanding. They make conversations smoother. They're often used in teamwork and decision-making. Let's slow down again. Long listening is not about constant intensity. It's about staying present over time. Notice how your ears stay with the language more easily now. That's endurance. That's progress. Even if you're not actively studying, your brain is learning. Now imagine someone talking about expectations. Fluent speakers often manage them carefully. They say, I'm trying to keep my expectations realistic, or I didn't want to get ahead of myself. These expressions reflect emotional balance. They're common in discussions about goals and plans. Advanced English mirrors this balanced mindset. Let's talk about describing involvement. Instead of saying, I'm involved, people say, I'm fairly hands-on with it, or I play a small role in that. These phrases add clarity. They show degree. They help listeners understand your level of responsibility. This kind of detail is common in fluent speech. Now consider how people describe hesitation again. But subtly, they say, I had some reservations, or I needed a bit more time to think it through. These expressions feel natural, because hesitation is natural. Advanced English doesn't hide uncertainty. It expresses it clearly and calmly. Let's move into how fluent speakers talk about outcomes. They rarely declare success or failure directly. They say things like, it turned out better than expected, or it didn't quite land the way we hoped. These phrases soften judgment. They allow reflection. This tone is very common in mature conversations. Now listen for how people express acceptance. They say, it is what it is, or I've come to terms with it. These expressions show emotional resolution. They're widely used because they reflect real coping strategies. Advanced English gives you language for acceptance without resignation. Let's talk about describing momentum. People say, things are starting to pick up, or we're gaining some traction. These phrases suggest movement and progress. They're common in business, projects, and personal goals. They sound dynamic but controlled. Let's slow down once more. Let the sound of the language carry you. You don't need to remember specific phrases. Just let them pass through your awareness. This is how fluency grows quietly. In the next section, we'll continue refining this sense of natural rhythm, subtle confidence, and real-life expression that defines truly advanced English. Keep listening. Stay relaxed. As you continue listening, you may notice how fluent speakers are comfortable leaving things unsaid. They trust the listener to understand context. This is an important shift at higher levels. Instead of explaining everything, they imply, for example, rather than saying, I didn't reply because I was busy and overwhelmed, they might simply say, I've been tied up lately. The meaning is clear without extra detail. This kind of economy of language is very common in native speech. Now let's talk about describing pressure in a quieter way. Instead of dramatic language, fluent speakers say things like, there's been a bit of tension around that, or it's been hanging over me for a while. These expressions sound natural because they're understated. They reflect how people actually talk when they don't want to exaggerate. Advanced English often prefers understatement to intensity. Let's move into how people talk about effort again, but this time with restraint. Instead of saying, I worked extremely hard, they say, I put in the hours, or I gave it a fair amount of attention. These phrases suggest commitment without boasting. This tone is widely respected in English-speaking cultures. It signals quiet confidence. Now imagine someone talking about improvement in others. Fluent speakers don't praise excessively. They say, you've come a long way, or there's been a noticeable improvement. These expressions are encouraging but grounded. They're used in workplaces, classrooms, and personal relationships. They show recognition without exaggeration. Let's talk about describing setbacks. Advanced speakers don't dramatize them. They say, we hit a bit of a setback, or it slowed things down for a while. These phrases normalize difficulty. They make challenges feel manageable. This kind of language helps keep conversations constructive. Now let's focus on how fluent speakers manage expectations with others. Instead of saying, I can't promise anything, they say, I don't want to overpromise, or I'd rather not commit just yet. These expressions are polite and clear. They protect relationships while maintaining honesty. This is a high-level communication skill. Let's move into describing perspective. People often say, from where I'm standing, or the way I see it. These phrases frame opinions as personal views rather than absolute truths. They reduce conflict and invite dialogue. This approach is extremely common in fluent English. Now listen for how people talk about change again. But over longer periods, they say, over the years, my outlook has shifted. Or, with time, I've learned to approach things differently. These expressions show maturity. They're often used in reflective conversations. Advanced English supports this kind of thoughtful expression. Let's slow down and focus on how fluent speakers express satisfaction. Instead of saying, I'm satisfied, they say, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Or, it met my expectations. These phrases sound realistic. They reflect measured judgment. This tone is common in professional reviews and personal reflections. Now consider how people talk about alignment with values. They say, it feels right to me, or it aligns with what I care about. These expressions connect decisions to identity. They're powerful, but understated. This is advanced, natural English. Let's talk about describing involvement again. But more precisely, instead of saying, I helped, people say, I played a part, or I was involved to some extent. These phrases clarify contribution. They're honest and flexible. This level of precision is typical of fluent speakers. Now imagine someone describing curiosity. Instead of saying, I'm curious, they say, I wanted to explore that a bit more, or I was interested in seeing where it would lead. These expressions sound engaged and thoughtful. They show active interest rather than passive curiosity. Let's move into expressing patience. Fluent speakers often say, I'm willing to give it time, or I'm in no rush. These phrases signal calm. They reduce pressure in conversations. This kind of language is especially valuable in negotiations and relationships. Let's slow down again. Notice how these expressions feel. They're not flashy, they're steady. That steadiness is what makes advanced English sound confident. Now consider how people describe collaboration again. But informally, they say, "We bounced ideas around," or "We worked it out together." These phrases feel natural and conversational. They're used daily. Advanced English is full of these informal but precise expressions. Let's talk about describing boundaries gently. Instead of saying, "I don't want to do that," people say, "I'm not comfortable going down that route," or "I'd rather not take it in that direction." These expressions protect boundaries while maintaining respect. This is real-life language. Now imagine someone talking about acceptance again. They say, "I've made peace with it," or "I've learned to live with it." These phrases suggest resolution. They're common in conversations about change and loss. Advanced English gives you language for these moments too. Let's stay with the rhythm. Let the listening continue without effort. In the next part, we'll keep building on this sense of natural restraint, emotional clarity, and quiet confidence that define truly fluent speech. Keep listening. As you stay immersed in the sound of English, you may start to feel how fluent speakers create space in conversations. They don't crowd the exchange. They allow ideas to breathe. This shows up in phrases like, "I'll let that sink in for a moment," or "Take your time." These expressions reduce pressure. They signal patience. This is a subtle but powerful part of advanced communication. It makes others feel comfortable. Now let's talk about how people describe focus and distraction. Instead of saying, "I can't focus," fluent speakers say, "I'm having trouble staying focused," or "I keep getting sidetracked." These phrases feel natural because they describe experience, not failure. This tone matters. It keeps conversations supportive rather than critical. Let's move into how fluent speakers describe readiness. Instead of saying, "I'm ready," they say, "I feel prepared," or "I'm in a good place to move forward." These expressions suggest mental readiness, not just completion. They're often used before important decisions or changes. Advanced English allows you to express readiness with nuance. Now consider how people talk about learning again. But socially, they say, "I picked up a few things along the way," or "I learned more than I expected." These phrases are casual. They don't sound like study. They sound like life. This is how native speakers talk about learning in everyday contexts. Let's talk about describing disappointment gently. Instead of saying, "I'm disappointed," people say, "It wasn't quite what I'd hoped for," or "I was a little let down." These expressions soften emotion. They keep conversations balanced. This is very common in polite English. Now imagine someone reflecting on effort once more. Fluent speakers might say, "I gave it my best shot," or "I did what I could with what I had." These phrases show acceptance and self-respect. They're widely used because they reflect real effort without regret. Let's move into describing trust. People say things like, "I feel comfortable with that," or "I trust your judgment." These expressions are direct but warm. They build relationships. Advanced English isn't just about clarity. It's about connection. Let's slow down and focus on how people describe pace. Instead of saying, "It's slow," they say, "It's moving at its own pace," or "We're taking things gradually." These phrases remove negativity. They suggest intention rather than delay. This tone is common in mature conversations. Now consider how fluent speakers talk about complexity again, but lightly. They say, there are a few moving parts, or it's not entirely straightforward. These expressions acknowledge complexity without overwhelming the listener. This balance is a sign of advanced fluency. Let's talk about expressing relief once more. Instead of saying, I'm relieved now, people say, it's good to have that behind me, or I can finally move on. These phrases suggest closure. They're common after stressful periods. Advanced English gives you language for these transitions. Now imagine someone discussing curiosity and openness. They might say, I'm open to seeing where this goes, or I'm curious to explore it further. These expressions feel relaxed. They don't force outcomes. This openness is often heard in confident speakers. Let's move into how fluent speakers describe responsibility again. But emotionally, they say, I take that to heart, or I don't take that lightly. These phrases show seriousness. They communicate values without sounding heavy. This kind of language appears often in sincere conversations. Let's slow down again. Notice how the listening feels almost effortless now. That's a good sign. Your brain is adapting. It's recognizing patterns and predicting meaning. This is how fluency develops naturally. Now consider how people talk about letting go. They say, I decided to step back, or I needed to let it go. These expressions are simple but powerful. They're used when people protect their well-being. Advanced English gives you calm language for these moments. Let's talk about describing support. Fluent speakers say things like, I've got your back, or I'm here if you need anything. These expressions are direct and caring. They build trust. They're used daily among friends and colleagues. Now imagine someone reflecting on direction. They might say, I'm heading in a different direction now, or I'm reevaluating where I'm going. These phrases suggest intentional change. They're common in conversations about life and career. Let's stay with the flow. You don't need to do anything but listen. In the next section, we'll continue refining this natural, steady style of English that feels calm, confident, and deeply real. Keep listening. As the listening continues, you may notice how fluent speakers often sound grounded. Even when talking about uncertainty, they don't rush to conclusions. They leave space for things to evolve. You'll hear phrases like, I'm still feeling it out, or I'm taking it as it comes. These expressions sound calm because they accept uncertainty instead of fighting it. This mindset is deeply embedded in natural English. It shows emotional balance as much as language skill. Now let's talk about how people describe clarity. Instead of saying, I understand now, fluent speakers say, that cleared things up, or it's starting to make more sense. These phrases reflect a process. Understanding doesn't arrive instantly. It builds. Advanced English has language for that gradual clarity. Let's move into describing effort again, but mentally rather than physically. People say things like, I've been mentally juggling a few things, or I've had a lot to process lately. These expressions are extremely common. They capture modern life accurately. They sound natural because they describe shared experiences. Now imagine someone talking about commitment. Instead of saying, I'm committed, they say, I'm in it for the long haul, or I'm sticking with it. These phrases suggest endurance. They're often used when people talk about long-term goals, relationships, or personal development. Advanced English allows you to express commitment without sounding formal. Let's slow down and listen for tone again. Tone often matters more than content. A phrase like, I'll look into it, can sound supportive or dismissive depending on tone. Fluent speakers are aware of this. They adjust naturally. Long listening helps you internalize these subtle differences. You start to feel what sounds right. Now consider how people describe overwhelm gently. Instead of saying, "I'm overwhelmed," they say, "I've got a lot coming at me right now." Or, "It's been a bit much lately." These phrases soften the feeling without hiding it. They invite understanding rather than sympathy. This balance is very common in real conversations. Let's talk about how fluent speakers describe motivation fading. Instead of saying, "I'm not motivated," they say, "I've been struggling to stay motivated." Or, "My motivation comes and goes." These expressions feel honest. They reflect real human experience. Advanced English doesn't pretend. It describes reality calmly. Now imagine a conversation about reassessment. People often say, "I'm re-evaluating my approach," or "I might need to rethink this." These phrases show flexibility. They're common among confident speakers because confidence allows change. This kind of language appears often in professional and personal reflection. Let's move into describing success again. But quietly, instead of saying, "I succeeded," fluent speakers say, "It paid off," or "It worked out." These phrases are understated. They don't seek attention. This understated tone is very characteristic of native speech. Let's slow down once more. You may notice your breathing syncing with the rhythm of the language. That's a sign of relaxation. Relaxed listening helps deeper absorption. This is why long-form listening is so effective at higher levels. Now consider how people talk about trust in themselves. They say, "I trust my instincts," or "I feel confident in my judgment." These expressions are calm and centered. They don't sound defensive. They reflect self-assurance. Advanced English often mirrors emotional maturity. Let's talk about how fluent speakers describe limits again. But internally, instead of saying, "I can't handle this," they say, "I'm reaching my limit," or "I need to take a step back." These phrases express boundaries with self-respect. They're common in conversations about mental health and balance. Now imagine someone talking about focus returning. They might say, "I'm finding my rhythm again," or "I'm getting back into the flow." These expressions are widely used. They describe recovery and adjustment. This kind of language helps conversations feel hopeful without pressure. Let's move into describing cooperation again. Fluent speakers say things like, "We're aligned on this," or "We're moving in the same direction." These phrases suggest shared purpose. They're common in teamwork and planning. Advanced English gives you flexible ways to express unity. Let's slow down and notice how little effort it takes to follow now. Even complex ideas feel manageable. That's not accidental. It's the result of sustained exposure. Your brain is doing exactly what it should. Now consider how people talk about acceptance again. But with growth. They say, "I've learned to be okay with it," or "I've come to accept it over time." These expressions show adaptation. They're used when people talk about life changes honestly. Advanced English supports these deeper reflections. Let's stay with the sound a little longer. In the next stretch, we'll move toward closure, integration, and the kind of calm confidence that stays with you even after the listening ends. Keep listening. Stay present. As we move closer to the end of this long listening session, you may notice a sense of steadiness in the language. Fluent speakers often sound settled. They're not pushing ideas. They're letting them land. You'll hear phrases like, "I'm comfortable with where things are right now," or "I'm at peace with that decision." These expressions reflect acceptance, not passivity. They show confidence without force. This is a common tone at higher levels of fluency. Now let's talk about integration. Integration is when language feels like part of you, not something you're using. Fluent speakers say things like, "It's become second nature," or "It just feels normal now." These phrases describe a shift that many advanced learners experience quietly over time. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It grows through consistent exposure. Like what you're doing right now. Let's slow down and reflect on how people describe learning again. But from a long-term view, they say, "I've been at it for a while now," or "It's been a gradual process." These expressions are realistic. They respect time. Advanced English mirrors this respect for process. It doesn't rush results. Now consider how people talk about confidence without bragging. Instead of saying, "I'm confident," they say, "I feel good about where I'm at," or "I trust myself more now." These phrases sound grounded. They suggest growth without comparison. This tone is very common in mature, fluent speakers. Let's move into describing closure. People often say, "I'm ready to put that behind me," or "I've reached a point where I can move forward." These expressions signal transition. They're used at the end of phases, projects, or emotional chapters. Advanced English has calm language for endings. Now listen for how fluent speakers express gratitude. Instead of dramatic thanks, they say, "I appreciate it," or "That means a lot to me." These phrases are simple but sincere. They're used constantly. They build connection without excess. This is real-life English. Let's slow down again. There's no need to rush the ending. Long listening works because it mirrors real time. Life doesn't jump from beginning to end. It flows. Now imagine someone talking about reflection. They might say, "It's given me a lot to think about," or "I've learned more from it than I expected." These phrases show quiet insight. They're common in thoughtful conversations. Advanced English often sounds reflective rather than declarative. Let's talk about describing alignment. One last time. People say, "It feels right for me," or "I'm comfortable with that choice." These expressions connect decision and identity. They're calm and clear. They don't seek approval. This is the voice of confidence. Now consider how people describe readiness to continue. They say, "I'm ready to take the next step," or "I'm looking ahead now." These phrases suggest forward movement without urgency. They're hopeful, but steady. Advanced English carries this tone naturally. Let's slow down and notice the rhythm again. The pace has been consistent. That consistency helps your mind relax. Relaxed attention is where deep learning happens. Even now, your brain is still absorbing structure, tone, and flow. Now imagine someone concluding a conversation gently. They might say, "Let's leave it there for now," or "We can pick this up another time." These phrases create soft endings. They're polite and natural. They don't feel abrupt. Advanced English pays attention to how conversations end. Let's move into acceptance again, but with intention. People say, "I'm content with how things are unfolding," or "I'm open to whatever comes next." These expressions combine acceptance and openness. They're very common in reflective speech. Let's slow down once more. Take a breath. Let the sound of English stay with you. You don't need to replay anything yet. Just let it settle. In the final part, we'll bring this session to a close in a way that feels natural, grounded, and complete. Stay with me a little longer. As we come to the close of this long listening session, let the final moments feel unhurried. Fluent speakers don't rush endings. They allow space for reflection. You'll often hear phrases like, "I think this is a good place to pause," or "That feels like a natural stopping point." These expressions sound calm because they respect the rhythm of conversation. Advanced English is deeply connected to this sense of timing. Now let's talk about carrying language with you beyond this session. Fluent speakers don't switch English on and off. It stays with them in the background. They say things like, "It's just part of how I think now," or "I don't really notice it anymore." These phrases describe integration. Language becomes a tool, not a task. This is what long exposure creates over time. Let's reflect on how people describe consistency. They say, "I just try to show up regularly," or "I focus on staying consistent rather than intense." These expressions are realistic. They reflect habits, not motivation. Advanced English often mirrors this steady mindset. Now imagine someone offering encouragement without pressure. They might say, "You're on the right track," or "Keep doing what you're doing." These phrases are supportive but light. They don't demand change. They acknowledge effort. This tone is very common among fluent speakers. Let's move into describing rest and recovery. Instead of saying, "I need a break," people say, "I'm going to take it easy for a bit," or "I need some time to recharge." These expressions feel natural. They reflect self-awareness. Advanced English gives you calm language for slowing down. Let's slow down together now. Notice how the English feels familiar. The structure, the rhythm, the tone. This familiarity is not an accident. It's the result of staying with the language long enough for it to stop feeling foreign. That's a major step toward true fluency. Now consider how people talk about continuation. They say, "I'll keep at it," or "I'm planning to stick with it." These phrases are simple, but powerful. They express intention without drama. This is how fluent speakers talk about long-term goals. Let's talk about closing thoughts. Fluent speakers often say, "All in all, it's been a valuable experience," or "I'm glad I took the time." These expressions summarize without overanalyzing. They bring things together gently. This is how real conversations often end. Let's move into gratitude one last time. Thank you for spending this time listening, reflecting, and staying present. If this session helped you feel more comfortable with English, remember to like the video, subscribe to English in Mastery, and return for more long-form listening practice. Consistency matters more than intensity. Now let the sound fade naturally. You don't need to do anything else. Just carry this calm, steady English with you into the rest of your day. Before we truly finish, I want to step out of the listening flow for a moment and share something personal with you. Not as a teacher standing above you, and not as someone selling quick results, but as someone who has spent years observing how people actually learn English in real life. What you've just experienced in this session is not accidental. Long listening, calm pacing, familiar language, and repeated exposure are not trends. They are reflections of how language is absorbed naturally. I've seen many learners struggle not because they lack ability, but because they're constantly told that learning must feel hard, fast, or uncomfortable to be effective. In my experience, the opposite is often true. The learners who make lasting progress are the ones who stay with the language long enough for it to feel normal. They stop chasing dramatic breakthroughs and start building quiet familiarity. That's why I believe listening like this matters. It trains patience, it trains attention, and more importantly, it trains trust in the process. One thing I've learned over time is that fluency doesn't arrive with a clear moment where everything suddenly clicks. It arrives gradually. One day you realize you understood a full conversation without effort. Another day you respond naturally without rehearsing. These moments don't announce themselves. They simply appear when your brain has had enough exposure. That's why I design content like this, to be long, steady, and realistic, not to overwhelm you, but to mirror how English exists in the real world. Native speakers don't speak in perfect lessons. They speak in flowing thoughts, pose, corrections, and reflections. If your practice doesn't reflect that, your fluency won't either. Another personal belief I want to share is this. Vocabulary alone does not create confidence. Grammar alone does not create clarity. Confidence comes from familiarity. When phrases stop feeling new, they stop feeling scary. When sentence structures repeat often enough, your brain stops analyzing them. That's when English becomes usable. That's why this session focused on everyday language rather than impressive words. In real conversations, people don't aim to sound advanced. They aim to be understood. And ironically, that's what makes them sound advanced. I've also learned that many learners underestimate the emotional side of language learning. Feeling relaxed matters. Feeling safe matters. If you're constantly tense while listening or speaking, your brain stays in survival mode. It doesn't absorb deeply. Long listening sessions like this are meant to create a calm environment where learning happens quietly. You don't need to remember every sentence. You don't need to repeat everything perfectly. Just staying present is enough. Over time, that presence becomes progress. I want to be honest about something else as well. There is no single video, no single method, and no single channel that will make you fluent overnight. Anyone who promises that is not being realistic. What does work is consistency. Showing up regularly. Letting English be part of your daily environment. Even when you're tired. Even when you're not actively studying. Especially then. That's how language becomes internal. If you take anything from this session, let it be this. Fluency is not something you chase. It's something you allow to grow. My role with English in Mastery is not to overwhelm you with information. It's to give you a space where English feels steady, human, and usable. A place where you can listen without pressure and trust that your brain knows what to do. I genuinely believe that learners around the world need more of this kind of practice. Not louder voices. Not faster speech. Not more complicated explanations. But more real exposure. More time with the language as it actually exists. If you've stayed until this point, I want to thank you. Not just for watching, but for giving yourself the time to listen. That choice matters more than you might realize. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your level feels like today, progress is happening quietly when you listen like this. Keep returning to English. Keep letting it surround you. And most importantly, keep trusting that clarity comes with time. This is not the end of your learning. It's simply another moment along the way. And when you're ready, English will meet you where you are.